G'day everyone, Scott from Archery Creations here. In this video, I'm taking on a project that I've really always wanted to do, and that's combining Australian red gum timber with Jesmonite's AC730 silver grey granite with a little bit of epoxy resin thrown in. This combination is not something I'd seen really much before at all. So in this video, I go through all of the steps that I went through to get to the final product and what I learned along the way. So I hope you enjoy. For this timber and Jesmonite AC730 table, I've got this beautiful piece of Australian red gum timber. It's already been kiln dried and dressed to 80 grit sanding. I'm just using a wire wheel to clean up the edges here and get any loose material off so it doesn't contaminate my pour. This table's been trimmed already. It's roughly 600 by 1200, so it's ready to go. Jesmonite AC730 being a cementous based product, it's not going to hold on to the timber like resin. So I need to do something to tie it into the timber somehow. So for this project, I'm going to use bugle screws. I've drilled these holes every 40 or 50 millimeters down the side, and I'm going to put some PVA glue in each of these holes. I've lined the slab up on the table that I've got it sitting on just to make sure it's going to sit inside the cavity of my formwork. Incredibly hard, this red gum, Australian red gum, even though I've pre-drilled the holes. This last one, you'll see it squeezes a bit of glue out through the top. I've already made up my formwork out of form ply, and I'm just sitting it in to make sure it all fits before I do the other side, make sure I haven't made any mistakes. Everything sits in there. The screws don't touch the base and they're not going to sit proud above the top of the slab. Now the screws have been installed on both sides, I'm just about ready to do the pour. So I've come over to our studio with my slab and formwork. I'm going to be doing this pour upside down, so the top of this slab sitting in the formwork is actually going to be the bottom of the table. The reason for that is the bubbles in the AC730 are going to rise to the surface, which is actually going to be the bottom of the table, which should give me a cleaner, more bubble-free surface at the top. I'm using AC730 from Jesmonite in the silver grey granite. It's an acrylic polymer liquid with a cementous base powder. It's got micro aggregate in the silver grey granite, which gives it that sort of fleck, stone fleck through it when you etch it or sand it back. So it looks fantastic. It's a 5:1 by weight, and I'm adding a little bit of retarder in there as well to slow down the curing process, which gives me a little more working time because it actually sets a lot faster normally than concrete. Use a drill mixer to mix it up, just making sure there's no dry pockets left and it's thoroughly mixed. With the help of Jesmonite's online calculator, I've calculated that this piece should use about 13 kilos of AC730, so hopefully this is enough. Okay, my mix is ready to go. I've scraped down the sides of the bucket. So I'm going to half fill this mold that I've made, half fill the cavity. When I did this mix, I didn't have any Plasticiser. Now that's a product that you can add to this type of mix to help it pour better and so it flows a little bit better. If I did this table again, I would definitely add some of that to my mix as well. I thought it'd be a good idea to rub the Jesmonite onto the live edge and make sure that was well coated, so there was no air bubbles between the Jesmonite and the timber. In hindsight, that may not have been the best thing to do. The timber sucked the moisture out of the Jesmonite quicker than the rest of the Jesmonite. So next time I might seal the edge with something so that doesn't happen. So what I'm doing here is moving it around and just agitating it just to try and get it into all of the voids, and just working it to try and get all of the bubbles to rise to the top that's in that first couple of centimetre layer. Just pouring the rest of the mix in now. Hopefully I've done up enough to bring us up level with the top. The volume calculation was actually pretty spot on, so I didn't really have too much or too little. I'm just going to scrape off the excess that sort of ended up on top of the timber slab, just to make sure that the Jesmonite and the timber slab is as level as possible to make it a bit easier to finish the slab later on. A couple of hours have gone past and it's time to demold. I've used just some lightweight pins out of the nail gun to hold the formwork together, so they bend out of the way nice and easily, so it's pretty easy to tap off the formwork. If you remember right, I molded this upside down, so the base of the slab that was sitting on the formwork is actually the top of the table. So this turned out to be a really good choice, as it gave me a really nice smooth finish that's going to be the top of the table. So straight out of the mold, it already looked pretty good. Okay, the next thing to do now is get this thing sanded. There's a bit of a challenge working out what to sand it with. You know, there's products for sanding concrete and there's products for sanding timber, but there's not that much that does both well. So I ended up deciding on silicon carbide paper, just a bit more durable, hopefully, and we'll see what happens. Starting off with sanding the bottom, and then I'll flip it over and do some passes on the top. I've just used 60 grit sandpaper, really just using it to get it all level, and then I'll sand it by hand with an orbital after that. I got about 6 to 8 passes on the drum sander before I needed to change the belts. The Jesmonite dulled the sandpaper even quicker than I expected. Getting pretty close to the finish. This is the top side now, and yeah, it's level and looking pretty good, I think. So pretty happy with where it's at. 1 or 2 passes and I think it'll be ready to go. In the process of running it through the drum sander, I took a couple of millimeters off both sides. This exposed some of the cracks in the timber. I'm going to use epoxy resin to fill these cracks and get a nice smooth surface. Here I've mixed the Delcam crystal clear epoxy resin with one of our pearl powders called Chimney Sweeper. It is a charcoal pearl powder and should look fantastic in a table like this. Little batch mixed up, there's only a few small cracks, and just pour it in. As with all resin, hit it with a butane torch, that pops the bubbles that have risen to the top. Try and get it as bubble free as possible, so when I sand the excess off, it doesn't open up voids in the resin. In a couple of days, this resin will be hard enough to sand, and I'll be able to continue on with finishing the rest of the piece. I've sanded the coffee table top, bottom and sides with 80 grit on the orbital sander, and now I want to put a bevel edge on the coffee table. So this was a bit of a challenge because I couldn't just go around it with a 45-degree bit on the trim router. So I had to use the sander just with the same 80 grit sandpaper and just did it by sight and feel. You may have noticed some black resin on the edges of the table. I found a hairline crack down each side, which turned out to be right where the last screw was. I think the head of the screw was just a little close to the edge of the table. So I broke this Jesmonite away, I made the edge look a little more irregular, and then filled it with some black resin. I've been working my way up through the grits with my 6-inch orbital from the 80 grit that I started with earlier. Now that I'm up to the final few grits, I'm using the air compressor and the blower just to remove any stones that might have come off the Jesmonite, any grit that's sitting on top of the timber, so that when I do my next pass with the orbital, it doesn't scratch that grit into the surface of the timber. I've done the whole piece, top, bottom and sides to 240 grit, and then done a final run over the timber with 400 grit, including the resin as well. Okay, I'm up to the final exciting steps, sealing this puppy up. I wanted a sealer that I could just put over both the Jesmonite and the timber, and for that I chose Gillies liquid beeswax. It's nice and easy to rub on with a microfiber cloth, and it coated really nicely over the timber and the Jesmonite, and once dry leaves a nice satin or matte to satin finish. I did 2 coats over the whole piece, top, bottom and sides, and then the next step is to put the legs on. I found some legs at the local hardware store that I thought would look fantastic on this coffee table. And whilst they look fantastic, they're a bit of a nightmare to fit. And the reason is they taper into the center, which meant I couldn't use a battery drill driver to screw the screws in. So I pre-drilled the holes into the red gum, which is a really hard Australian hardwood. And even then, I had to use a short stubby Phillips head screwdriver and I reckon I got a couple of blisters just putting in 4 screws. That was a bit of a nightmare, but I think they did look really good, so I was happy with how it ended up. The final step that I did was just put a 3rd coat of the liquid beeswax on the top and sides of the table, and here it is, my Australian red gum and Jesmonite AC730 coffee table. If you did enjoy this video, give us a like, we really appreciate it.